Greetings and welcome. My name is Ryan O'Rourke from Stay Creative Painting. I truly hope you enjoy today's 10-minute painting. And if you have any questions or inquiries regarding today's tutorial, please leave me a comment in the comment section down below or send me a message over on the Facebook page. I'm always here and happy to help. Speaking of help, if you'd like assistance with the drawing process, I also offer the digital sketch for this 10-minute painting lesson and many others over on the Patreon page, in addition to reference photos and over a dozen hour-long painting lessons as well. So if any of that interests you, go check it out. Again, I am here to help. And now let's jump into today's 10-minute painting lesson. We are going to begin here today, as we generally do, with our large damp square-headed brush. Here I have some titanium white on that brush, and I'm simply applying it to the base of my horizon with a good amount of horizontal strokes. Then I'm going to go back to my palette and grab about an equal mixture of titanium white and primary blue. From there, I'm applying that on top of my initial application, and then I'm beginning to blend downwards slightly. I want the base of my sky to be much brighter, and then as we progress upwards, it should get more and more blue in it. So as you can see, as we move towards the top of the sky, I interject just a little bit more of that primary blue mixture. And I ensured that the whole blending process was very smooth and that I was able to mix each color in with the next very simply by ensuring that my brush was indeed damp, as that will extend the wet life of your paint and allow you to drag it out a little bit farther. It'll make blending larger areas much more simple. So from there, I'm going to take that same brush, and this time I'm going to interject a little bit of Mars Black into that mixture that we used at the top of the sky. This is going to mix with the white in the mixture and make it a little bit more gray and desaturated, which is actually fantastic for the background. Generally, when we're painting a landscape, we want the background to be more desaturated, and as we move forward in the painting, things slowly get more color in them. And this is going to integrate a level of depth into your painting, as the background generally has a lot of reflected light from everything around it being cast down upon it. And so you get a mixture of different colors in these situations, whereas the foreground, you much more see the innate coloring of subjects. So as you can see, I'm moving forward here, and I'm just trying to ensure that the blue gets much more natural, and I'm using less and less Mars Black in that mixture so that we get a little bit more saturation and the colors pop as well. So it's a slow progression there. Now I want my water to kind of dry to a point before I go back in and begin integrating detail. So while I do that, I'm going to work on my rocks over here on the right. Now here I'm using a medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm using this brush because it can hold a good amount of paint, and that sharp edge is fantastic for working on sharper subjects such as rocks here. Now the mixture I'm using is very much a mixture of Mars Black and Burnt Umber, and I'm using this as my initial darker base coat. We're going to go back in and integrate a midtone and a highlight as well, but I want it to be fairly subtle initially, and that way we can really build on top of it with our layers, build light and build depth. When you want to create depth in a landscape generally, the foreground has much more of a saturation to it than the background, but also you want to kind of wrap light around subjects. So you can start with the darker tone, then you add a mid-tone to the side of the subject where the light is going to be hitting it, then you go back in and you add a highlight to that subject. That's exactly what we're going to do here, but we need to begin with that darker tone. We're simply building the foundation here, as you can see. I'm also allowing the edges of this to be a little bit more burnt umber than Mars Black. And then as I move farther behind the rocks, away from the light, I get darker and darker, and I integrate more of that Mars Black in there as well. As you can see, I'm also throwing a couple of these rocks out into the ocean as well, except these are much smaller. They're not actually much smaller size-wise, but because of the perspective, because of how close we are to the ones in the foreground, they're going to look a lot smaller. And because we're putting these in the background, we're also going to add another level of depth to the painting. So I frequently get asked, how do you add depth to paintings? There are a number of great ways to do it. One is through doing the midtones and the highlights, one is through saturation, another is through showing multiple subjects through different areas of the foreground, middle ground, and background of your painting to illustrate the size difference and kind of how vast a landscape can be. Now here you can see that I'm going back into those rocks. I'm using the smaller square-headed brush this time because I wanted a little bit more detail. And here I'm using a mixture of a burnt umber and a titanium white. And I'm using this along the edges to make it brighter. I'm using a bit of a choppy application, but I'm still trying to ensure that my brush strokes are fairly sharp. Now you can render fairly soft looking rocks by doing a lot of blending, or you can do a bit of a choppy motion, get a lot of sharp streaky brush strokes, and that'll give the rocks a lot more of a hardened effect. Now here, the rocks are being protruding from water, right? So they are probably getting a lot of water on them, which would soften and erode the rock, but you can also do a lot of a sharper rock as well. I went for kind of a middle ground here. There are slight blends in it, but there are also sharper areas just to really illustrate the fact that it is in fact rock. Now from there I'm switching over to a smaller round-headed brush, and I have some titanium white on it. Now the round-headed brush is very damp, so it's going to allow me to apply this paint without getting a gritty canvas-like aesthetic, and I'm using this swirling motion. As you can see, I'm trying to get some good kind of implications of the tide coming in. I'm trying to allow some areas, especially the areas that drift off into the background, to become much more transparent, small, and as you can see, they kind of just drift off. They get smaller as well. We talked about perspective in regards to the rocks, but in regards to water and tide and waves and all of that, when we get to very close to us in the painting, we want our waves and our water and all of those implications to be much larger. And they need to get smaller and smaller as you move away. Again, it's just an easy way of illustrating depth in your painting and ensuring that it all doesn't look too flat or like it's all happening in a very condensed area. Now here, as you can see, I'm doing a lot of blending as well. The water on my brush is helping me do that, and I'm doing a technique here that's really a combination of very choppy strokes on the canvas. They are smaller, they are larger. I'm trying to keep it diverse and interesting, but I'm picking a general motion and curve to go with. So it looks like the water is moving in a similar direction, but maybe it's hitting different currents, or there are different rocks underneath that are kind of changing things, different wind patterns as well. Just trying to make sure that a simple piece can still look interesting and diverse. And that's exactly what we're doing there. And it's something that I'll go back to a number of times. Now, it's also worth noting, I didn't apply these initial applications of white initially because they would have blended too much with the wet water paint, right? We wouldn't have got that stark white, we would have gotten a slightly brighter blue. And that really isn't what I wanted here. I wanted something that really popped as it was in the foreground, and the foreground is generally where we apply our darkest, our lightest values, and our most saturated pigments as well. So I was essentially just trying to ensure that we got that color as bright as possible, and we wouldn't have been able to achieve that if the initial base layer of water was still wet. Now I'm taking the smaller square-headed brush that we used for the midtones in the mountains, and I'm just kind of outlining the edges of the mountains where we meet the water to ensure that there's a bit of a kind of tide rushing up onto it. You can see that it's kind of crashing into it a little bit, but we're still not that close. This is a very large rock, and so we don't see all of the detail, but we get enough of an implication for one. Then I go back into the water and I add some additional details. I try to do this in a number of steps here, just to ensure that I'm progressively adding the right amount and I don't kind of overdo it. I do enough, I take a minute or two break, I kind of look at it, I evaluate, I say, hey, is that really what I want? Do I want more of this? Do I want to test that? If the answer is yes, then I'll go back and I'll add a little bit more of it. So it's kind of an easy way to figure out like if you're done at something. Then I'm taking that smaller brush and I'm going back into the rock. I'm adding in some additional highlights. On the piece that very much protrudes more to the center of the piece, you can see the real difference between the highlights, the midtones, and the dark tones, and the way it kind of builds up there. And then as we get towards the larger rock, we still have kind of a similar effect, but I'm also allowing portions of it to be a little bit more grainy. And I always advocate to use a damp brush because it ensures that you don't see the tooth of the canvas as much and you don't get as much of a gritty effect. But rocks are really the one subject where that can actually be highly beneficial and look quite good because they are innately quite scratchy, right? They do have more of a hardened aesthetic. Perhaps smaller pieces of rock are protruding sharply and catching light. So just something else to kind of keep in mind. Then I went up into the clouds, and instead of doing horizontal clouds, I did these diagonal clouds to act as leading lines and draw the viewer's eye down into the rest of the piece. Now that is essentially our 10-minute version, but as per usual, I had a couple of extra ideas and I wanted to share them with you, so I thought I'd speed it up. But there is essentially our 10 to 11 minute painting. I truly hope you enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. In it, we talk about how to blend with water, how to mix our paint, what brushes to use in what situations, all of the things you need to know about before you jump into your first painting. There is also my second ebook, Painting Prompts for Beginners. It's essentially 21 digital sketches for days when you want to be creative, you want to make something, but you just don't have the ideas at that point. You can just pick one and paint it. Makes it really easy. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Again, if you want hour-long lessons, they are available over on the Patreon, along with the digital sketch of this and lots of reference photos as well. All of that being said, I post every Saturday. I can't wait to see you next Saturday. And above all, as always, stay creative.